"Did you like the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked with a smile as he set down the pumpkin pie on my small kitchen table, and in that single moment, I realized there are questions that don't come from love, but from assumptions. It was Thanksgiving Day, the kind with pale November sunlight slipping through thin curtains and the smell of roasted turkey lingering in a kitchen that had seen better years. My name is Margaret Harrison, I'm 72 years old, and I live in a 900-square-foot apartment on the edge of Cedar Grove, Ohio. The heater rattles every time it kicks on, and I keep it set at 62 degrees to save on the electric bill. I had spent the entire morning cooking David's favorite dishes: green bean casserole, sweet potatoes with brown sugar, homemade cranberry sauce, even though the grocery receipt meant I would be extra careful for the rest of the month. When he walked in, tall and polished in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, I felt that familiar swell of pride. He built a technology consulting company from scratch. At 38, he employs over 200 people. He drives a silver SUV that looks like it belongs in a magazine. Behind him stood his wife, Victoria, graceful and composed, her blonde hair perfectly set despite the cold wind outside. She carried a bouquet of flowers and kissed my cheek lightly, careful not to smudge her lipstick. We sat down to eat, and David talked about expanding to Seattle, about investors, about a new office overlooking the water. I listened the way mothers do, holding on to every word like it was proof that the sacrifices had meant something. Then, just as I poured coffee, he leaned back in his chair and asked that question about the lake house. I remember the exact sound of my spoon hitting the saucer. A small, sharp clink. "What lake house, honey?" I said, because I thought perhaps I had misheard him. He laughed softly, glancing at Victoria as if I were teasing. "The one on Lake Morrison. I transferred it to you 2 years ago. I even set up $1,500 a month for maintenance and expenses." $1,500 a month. I felt the number settle in my chest like cold air. For the past 2 years, I had been stretching every prescription, cutting my blood pressure pills in half when the copay felt too steep. I had postponed fixing the leak under my sink, placing a plastic bowl beneath it instead. I had layered sweaters instead of turning up the heat past 65. I have always believed that dignity is quiet. I did not gasp or raise my voice. I simply looked at my son and said, "David, I never received a lake house. And I have never seen $1,500 from anyone." The room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Victoria's fork slipped from her fingers and hit her plate with a soft metallic sound. David's smile faded, replaced by the focused expression he uses when something in a contract doesn't add up. "That's impossible," he said, already reaching for his phone. I had Rebecca handle all the paperwork. The deed was mailed. The payments were automated. Victoria stood up abruptly, brushing invisible crumbs from her skirt. "Maybe there's been some mistake at the bank," she said lightly, though her voice seemed a shade too bright. "These things happen." I folded my hands in my lap. I have lived long enough to know that when money disappears, it does not simply wander off. It is guided. David stepped into the hallway to call his assistant, and I could hear fragments of the conversation drifting back: account numbers, routing codes, confirmation emails. I stared at the framed photo on my wall of David at age 8, missing his 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera while holding a paper turkey he made in school. I raised him alone after his father passed away from a heart attack 15 years ago. I worked double shifts at the public library to keep the mortgage paid. I sold my engagement ring once to cover a semester of his tuition before buying it back years later when things steadied. When David returned to the kitchen, his face had lost its color. "Mom," he said slowly, "the money's been going somewhere. Just not to your account." I nodded once. I did not ask where. "Not yet." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling them softly. Inside, the turkey sat untouched, steam fading into the quiet. Thanksgiving is supposed to be about gratitude, about counting blessings. That afternoon, I counted something else instead. I counted 2 years of cold evenings. 2 years of careful grocery lists. 2 years of believing that my son was simply busy, not that something meant for me had been quietly redirected. Victoria stood by the sink, her reflection faint in the darkened window. She did not meet my eyes. And for the first time since they walked through my door, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not yet, but clarity. Because when a question exposes a lie, it does more than reveal what was taken. It reveals who assumed you would never look closely enough to notice. David did not sit back down. He remained standing near the doorway, his phone still in his hand, as if the weight of it had suddenly increased. I could hear Rebecca's voice faintly through the speaker, professional and steady, confirming details that did not belong to me. The deed to the property at Lake Morrison had been processed 2 years ago. The monthly transfers of $1,500 had been executed without interruption. The recipient account had been updated shortly after the initial setup. Updated. It is a gentle word for something that changes the direction of money. I watched Victoria as she reached for the sink faucet and turned it on, though there was nothing to rinse. The water ran for several seconds before she realized and shut it off. Who authorized the account change? David asked, his tone controlled but no longer casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Your wife provided the new banking details, sir, Rebecca answered. She said your mother had switched banks. I felt the air leave my lungs slowly, not in a gasp but in understanding. 2 years ago, I had not switched banks. I had not changed anything except the way I folded my grocery coupons and the hours I kept my lights off in the evening. David lowered the phone from his ear and stared at Victoria as though seeing her for the first time. Victoria, he said quietly, did you give Rebecca a different account number? She turned toward him, her expression arranged into something that might have passed for concern under better circumstances. I was trying to simplify things, she said. Your mother does not always keep up with paperwork. I thought it would be easier if the funds went through an account I could monitor. Monitor. Another gentle word. I folded the cloth napkin beside my plate and placed it carefully on the table. For 2 years, I had believed that my son's distance was simply the cost of success. He called less often. He visited only on holidays. I told myself that building a company takes time, that ambition requires focus. I did not tell myself that somewhere, a house with wide windows and a view of water carried my name on its deed while I counted quarters before doing laundry. And the lake house? David pressed. Where is the deed now? Victoria hesitated just long enough for the truth to reveal its outline. My parents have been staying there, she admitted. It was empty. We thought it made sense. They needed somewhere to recover after my father's surgery. It is not as if your mother was using it. Not using it. I thought of the afternoons I had spent sitting by my apartment window, watching the parking lot instead of a shoreline. I thought of the way I wrapped myself in an extra blanket last winter when the temperature dropped below 30 degrees and the old heater struggled to keep up. I did not interrupt. I have learned that silence can be more revealing than any accusation. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he has carried since childhood when confusion overtakes him. That house was for my mother, he said. And the money was for her expenses. Victoria's voice sharpened slightly. And what expenses does she have, David? She lives modestly. She does not travel. She does not entertain. I looked at her then, fully and without flinching. You are correct, I said evenly. I do live modestly. I have learned to. The clock above my stove ticked louder than usual. Outside, a neighbor's car door slammed, the sound crisp in the cold air. Thanksgiving continued in other homes, plates clinking, laughter rising. In my kitchen, the turkey cooled untouched. David picked up his phone again. Rebecca, he said, returning to the call, freeze any further transfers immediately. I want a full record of every payment and every document related to the Lake Morrison property. His voice carried a firmness I recognized from the little boy who once insisted on fairness when someone cut in line at school. Victoria's composure wavered. You are overreacting, she said. This is a family matter. I stood slowly, my knees reminding me of my age but my posture straight. It became a family matter the moment my name was used without my knowledge, I replied. I walked to the window and looked out at the gray November sky. For 2 years, I had adjusted my life downward without complaint. I turned the thermostat lower. I postponed replacing my worn winter coat. I told friends I preferred staying home rather than admitting that I could not afford the restaurant they suggested. I did not resent my son's wealth. I was proud of it. But pride does not warm a cold apartment. Behind me, I heard Victoria inhale sharply as David asked one final question into the phone. Rebecca, whose name is on the maintenance account receiving the $1,500. The answer came quietly but clearly enough that even from where I stood, I heard it. Victoria Harrison. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in sorrow but in recognition. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a clerical error. A deliberate redirection, dressed in politeness. When I turned back around, I did not see a villain. I saw a young woman who had assumed that age meant ignorance, that quiet meant weakness, that modest living meant lack of awareness. And I saw my son beginning to understand that generosity is not meaningful if it never reaches its intended hands. The turkey would have to be reheated later, if anyone still had an appetite. For now, there were numbers to trace, signatures to examine, and a truth that had only just begun to surface. The house felt smaller after the truth was spoken out loud. It was not the square footage that changed, but the air inside it. David ended the call with Rebecca and placed his phone face down on the table as if he needed both hands free to process what he had just heard. Victoria remained near the counter, her shoulders stiff, her composure no longer polished but strained. I returned to my seat and began slicing the turkey, steady and deliberate, because meals do not pause simply because illusions break. The knife moved through the meat with a soft rhythm, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the scrape of silverware against china. Mom, David said finally, his voice lower than before, why did you not tell me you were struggling? I placed a slice of turkey onto his plate before answering. Because you were building something, I said. And I did not want my needs to feel like a distraction. He looked at me as though the idea unsettled him. For years I had told him that I was fine. When he asked about the heater, I said it worked well enough. When he asked if I needed anything, I said I had everything I required. It was not pride. It was habit. A mother learns to reduce herself so her child can expand. Victoria crossed her arms. You make it sound dramatic, she said. It was just a temporary adjustment. The house was sitting empty. I lifted my gaze to her. Empty to whom? I asked calmly. She did not respond. David pulled his chair back and sat down heavily. How long have your parents been there? He asked her. She hesitated before answering. Since the spring after you bought it. That was almost 2 full years. David inhaled slowly, the way he does before negotiating a contract. And the $1,500 each month, he pressed. It covered utilities, landscaping, property taxes, she replied quickly. And anything extra went into savings for renovations. I thought of the renovation I had postponed on my own bathroom, the cracked tile near the tub that I covered with a small rug. I thought of the winter morning when the temperature inside my apartment dropped to 58 degrees because the old furnace had faltered, and I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a quilt until it sputtered back to life. I had not called David that day. I had told myself he was busy. Now I understood that money meant for my comfort had been circulating elsewhere, justifying comfort for others. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Victoria, you used my mother's name to redirect funds. That is not simplification. That is deception. The word hung between them. She bristled. I did what made sense for our family, she insisted. My parents needed help. You had already provided for your mother. I felt no urge to defend myself. The facts were clearer than any emotion. Provided? I repeated gently. I have not seen a single dollar. Silence settled again, heavier this time. Outside, the sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Thanksgiving afternoon was fading, and with it, the version of our family that had existed an hour earlier. David stood up and began pacing the narrow space between the table and the living room. "I want to see every document," he said. "Every signature." Victoria's jaw tightened. "You are choosing her side without listening to mine." I folded my hands in my lap. "There are no sides," I said softly. "There is only what happened." I did not need to accuse her. The paper trail would speak. David stopped pacing and looked at me, really looked at me, as though noticing the fine lines around my eyes, the cardigan I had worn for years because it still fit, the careful way I portioned the cranberry sauce to make it last. "Mom," he said again, "how bad has it been?" I considered the question. I could have told him about skipping the annual eye exam because the co-pay felt indulgent. I could have mentioned selling a small collection of antique teacups online to cover an unexpected dental bill. I could have described the way I sometimes turned off the living room lamp and sat in dim light to reduce the electric bill by a few dollars. Instead, I chose a simpler truth. "It has been manageable," I said. "But it should not have been necessary." That sentence seemed to reach him more than any dramatic confession would have. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it. Victoria's voice softened slightly, though it carried defensiveness beneath the surface. "We were going to tell you," she said. "After things settled." I looked at her steadily. 2 years is not a temporary oversight, I replied. David picked up his phone once more. "Rebecca is sending the transaction history and copies of the deed," he said. "I am driving to Lake Morrison tomorrow." Victoria's eyes widened. "On Thanksgiving weekend?" He did not answer her. He looked at me instead. "Mom, you are coming with me." I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "I do not need to see the house to know what has been done. I need clarity, not scenery." The heater clicked on again, filling the quiet with its familiar hum. I realized that what I felt was not fury. It was adjustment. For 2 years I had adjusted downward, shrinking my needs to fit a smaller reality. Now the truth required a different adjustment. Not louder. Not cruel. Just precise. And as the daylight thinned and the plates remained mostly untouched, I understood that this Thanksgiving would not be remembered for the meal. It would be remembered as the day a question uncovered a ledger, and a ledger began to rewrite the balance of our family. The night after Thanksgiving stretched longer than usual, not because of noise but because of thought. David and Victoria left just before 8, their car headlights sweeping briefly across my living room wall before disappearing into the dark. I stood at the window until the parking lot returned to its ordinary stillness, then I turned off the lamp and sat down at the small desk by the bookshelf. I did not cry. I did not pace. I opened the folder where I keep my bank statements and laid them out in careful rows, month after month, 2 full years of numbers that had shaped my quiet adjustments. No deposits of $1,500. No irregular surges. Just my modest Social Security payment, a small pension from the public library, and the steady subtraction of rent, utilities, insurance, and groceries. I ran my finger down the columns as if touching proof of a life lived carefully. The heater clicked on again, pushing warm air into the room, and I wondered how many nights that maintenance money had been paying to heat a larger house by the lake while I wrapped myself in a quilt. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. The sky outside was pale and undecided, neither fully dark nor fully light. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, writing down questions instead of accusations. When exactly was the deed transferred? Who notarized it? Which account received the redirected funds? Precision has always steadied me. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was David. His voice sounded different, stripped of its usual confidence. He had driven to Lake Morrison at dawn. "Mom," he said quietly, "my in-laws are there. They have been living in the house full time." I closed my eyes briefly, not in shock but in confirmation. "And the documents?" I asked. "Rebecca emailed them. The account change form has your name typed at the top, but the signature is not yours. I felt no need to defend that fact. My handwriting has been the same for decades, careful loops and steady lines shaped by years of labeling books at the library. Victoria told me she thought it would simplify things, he continued. She said you would not mind because you never visit. I let that settle. I had never visited because I had never known. Did you speak to her parents? I asked. Yes, he replied after a pause. They said Victoria told them it was a temporary arrangement until you decided what to do with the property. Temporary. Another gentle word stretched beyond its meaning. I looked around my apartment, at the narrow hallway, the worn rug near the couch, the bookshelf filled with paperbacks collected over decades. I imagined a wide porch overlooking water, morning light reflecting off a calm surface, and I felt something unfamiliar rise within me. Not envy. Not regret. Ownership. It had been mine on paper, if not in experience. David, I said carefully, what matters now is not how it began. What matters is how it ends. He was silent for a moment. I should have checked, he admitted. I trusted her. I did not respond immediately. Trust is not foolish. It is simply incomplete without attention. You built a company by reviewing contracts, I said gently. Apply the same care to your family. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called me directly. Her tone was respectful, almost apologetic. She confirmed the transaction history, the automated transfers, the account listed under Victoria's name. She asked if I would like copies sent to me. Yes, I said. Send everything. When the email arrived, I printed the documents at the small copy center down the street. The clerk, a young man with headphones around his neck, handed me the stack without comment. I returned home and spread the pages across my kitchen table, the same table where the turkey had cooled the day before. There it was in black ink, my name attached to a property I had never seen, funds diverted through a simple form change, approvals granted in good faith. I examined the signature line and saw a version of my name that felt rehearsed, not lived. It is a strange experience to see yourself misrepresented on paper. It is quieter than anger and heavier than disappointment. That evening, David called again. I asked Victoria to come home, he said. We need to talk. His voice carried the strain of someone confronting more than numbers. Do not raise your voice, I advised softly. Facts are louder when spoken calmly. I set the documents back into their folder and placed it neatly on the desk. Outside, the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, and I turned the thermostat to 63 without guilt. For 2 years I had reduced my needs to match what I believed was reality. Now reality had shifted. I did not know exactly how the next days would unfold, but I knew this much: I would not shrink to accommodate someone else's convenience again. The lake house existed. The money existed. The paper trail existed. And for the first time since that question was asked over pumpkin pie, I felt the balance beginning to move, not through noise or spectacle, but through clarity. On Sunday afternoon, 2 days after Thanksgiving, David came to my apartment alone. I heard his car door close in the parking lot and recognized the slower rhythm of his steps on the sidewalk. When I opened the door, he looked less like a chief executive and more like the 8-year-old boy who once stood in my kitchen after breaking a neighbor's window, unsure how to explain himself. He did not remove his coat right away. He simply stepped inside and looked around as though he were measuring the space for the first time. I did not realize it was this small, he said quietly. I smiled faintly. It is large enough for one person who keeps her life simple, I replied. He ran his hand along the back of the worn sofa, then glanced at the thermostat mounted on the wall. You keep it at 63 degrees, he asked. Most days, I said. It is warmer when the sun cooperates. He exhaled slowly and sat down at the kitchen table where the documents were already waiting in a neat stack. I had arranged them in chronological order, each month's transfer highlighted in pale yellow. I did not push the papers toward him. I allowed him to reach for them on his own. He flipped through the pages, scanning the figures, the routing numbers, the signature that did not belong to me. She admitted it, he said after a moment. She said she thought it was harmless because the house would eventually be ours anyway. She believed you would never want to move there. I folded my hands on the table. Wanting and knowing are different things, I said. Choice requires awareness. He nodded, absorbing that distinction. Her parents said they will leave, he continued. They thought I had approved everything. I felt no bitterness toward them. They had accepted what they were told. The problem was not their presence by the lake. It was the assumption that I would not notice the absence of what was meant for me. What happens now? I asked calmly. David leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly. I am transferring the deed directly into a trust under your name alone, he said. No intermediaries. No shared oversight. And the monthly payments will resume, but this time into an account that only you control. I studied his face. There was determination there, but also something else. Regret. Do not correct this out of guilt, I said gently. Correct it because it is accurate. He met my eyes. It is accurate, he replied. And I should have checked sooner. The heater clicked on again, filling the small kitchen with a steady hum. I poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of him. Victoria is staying with her sister for a few days, he added. She says I embarrassed her by involving my assistant. I stirred my coffee slowly. Transparency feels like embarrassment when someone is not used to it, I said. He almost smiled at that. She says you are turning me against her, he continued. She believes this is about control. I looked at the documents once more, at the typed version of my name on a form I had never seen. Control is not what I am seeking, I said. Clarity is. He sat quietly for several seconds, the only sound the ticking clock above the stove. Would you ever live there? He asked suddenly. I considered the image of Lake Morrison, the photographs he had shown me on his phone years ago when he first described the purchase. Wide windows, a dock stretching into calm water, trees lining the shore in autumn colors. Perhaps, I said. Or perhaps I would rent it and use the income to repair this place and travel once in a while. The point is that it would be my decision. He nodded again, as though that idea had not fully occurred to him before. For years, I had minimized my presence in his life to avoid being a burden. Now I understood that invisibility invites assumptions. David, I said carefully, success does not excuse inattention. You review every contract your company signs. Apply that same diligence to your home. He looked down at his hands. I thought love was enough, he admitted. Love without awareness can become negligence, I replied, not harshly, simply truthfully. He stayed for another hour, discussing the legal steps he had already initiated. The trust documents would be drafted that week. The account would be established in my name alone. An accountant would audit the previous transfers. He spoke with the efficiency of a man accustomed to fixing errors quickly. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the doorway. Mom, he said, I am sorry. I walked with him to the door and adjusted his collar the way I used to when he was young. I raised you to correct mistakes, not to deny them, I said softly. After he left, the apartment felt different, not larger but steadier. I returned to the kitchen table and gathered the documents into their folder. Outside, the late November sky had turned a muted gray, and a thin wind moved across the parking lot. I turned the thermostat up to 65 degrees and allowed the heater to run a little longer than usual. For 2 years I had adapted to less. Now I was adjusting again, not upward in extravagance, but upward in self-recognition. The lake house still stood by the water. The funds still existed. The paperwork was being corrected. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving question was asked, I felt that the narrative of my own life was no longer being edited without my consent. The following week unfolded with a precision that felt almost unfamiliar in my quiet life. On Monday morning, David called to tell me the trust documents were being drafted by his attorney in Columbus. He explained that the lake house would be placed solely under the Margaret Harrison Revocable Trust, a structure that would ensure no one could alter ownership without my direct authorization. I listened carefully, asking questions about access, tax implications, and maintenance responsibilities. I had spent decades managing small budgets with discipline, and I intended to manage this larger asset with the same clarity. By Wednesday, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my apartment. I signed for it at the door and carried it to the kitchen table, where I had once spread out grocery flyers to compare prices. Inside were official drafts, crisp and orderly, bearing my full legal name. Seeing it printed correctly, without distortion or imitation, steadied something inside me. That afternoon, I drove to the bank in my modest sedan, the one I have maintained carefully for 10 years. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Elaine, greeted me with professional courtesy. I explained that I needed a new account established in my name alone, with no secondary access. I did not speak of betrayal. I spoke of structure. Elaine reviewed the paperwork, verified my identification, and created the account. When she asked if anyone else should have viewing rights, I answered calmly, no one. The word felt firm but not bitter. It was simply appropriate. By Friday, the first corrected transfer appeared pending in the new account. $1,500, labeled clearly as property maintenance allocation. I stared at the number on the screen for several seconds. It was not extravagance. It was acknowledgement. That same evening, David called again. His voice carried exhaustion but also resolve. Victoria does not agree with the changes, he said. She believes this makes her look untrustworthy. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the framed photograph of David at his college graduation, cap tilted slightly, eyes bright with possibility. Trust is built through transparency, I replied. If transparency damages someone's image, that is not the fault of the light. He was silent for a moment, absorbing the metaphor. She says I am choosing you over her, he added. This is not a competition, I said gently. It is a correction. The next day, he drove to Lake Morrison again, this time to meet with a property manager recommended by his attorney. He sent me photographs of the house, not the polished real estate images from years ago, but current ones. The dock extended calmly into still water. The porch chairs were arranged neatly. Autumn leaves gathered along the shoreline in muted gold and rust. I studied each image slowly. It was strange to see a place that carried my name yet felt unfamiliar. I did not experience resentment. I experienced reclamation. On Sunday afternoon, David called from the porch of the lake house. I could hear faint wind over the phone. It is quiet here, he said. You would like it. I smiled faintly. Quiet is not unfamiliar to me, I replied. He told me he had instructed Victoria's parents to vacate within 2 weeks and that he would oversee minor repairs personally. I want it ready for you, he said. I considered the invitation carefully. I will visit when I choose, I answered. Not because something is being proven. He understood. Later that evening, I opened my old ledger notebook and began listing potential uses for the property. Seasonal rental income. Long-term lease. Personal residence during summer months. Charitable retreat for widows who need rest. For the first time in years, my planning expanded instead of contracted. The heater hummed steadily at 65 degrees, and I allowed it to run without checking the clock. That small freedom felt symbolic. Over the next few days, the forensic accountant David hired completed a preliminary review. The report confirmed that approximately $36,000 had passed through Victoria's account over 2 years. The funds had covered utilities, landscaping, renovations, and some discretionary expenses unrelated to maintenance. David asked whether I wished to pursue reimbursement. I paused before answering. I want accountability, I said. Reimbursement will follow structure, not emotion. He agreed to have the attorney outline repayment terms separate from marital discussions. I did not ask about the state of his marriage. That was his responsibility to examine. My concern was clarity and stability. On Thursday evening, as I sat by the window watching early December frost settle across parked cars, I realized something had shifted quietly inside me. For years I had equated humility with invisibility. I believed that needing less made me easier to love. Now I understood that reducing myself had allowed others to expand beyond boundaries. The lake house remained by the water. The trust documents were nearly finalized. The corrected transfers were appearing as they should. And as winter approached, I no longer felt the need to shrink my expectations to fit someone else's convenience. The narrative was not dramatic. There were no raised voices in my apartment, no scenes of spectacle. There was simply paperwork corrected, ownership clarified, and a woman who had lived modestly for 2 years deciding that modesty would no longer be confused with absence. By mid-December, the paperwork was complete. The Margaret Harrison Revocable Trust had been officially recorded, and the deed to the lake house reflected my name without amendment or shared authority. David sent me a scanned copy of the final filing, and I studied it with the same quiet focus I once used to catalog rare books at the library. Accuracy matters. It is not dramatic, but it is decisive. The monthly transfer appeared again in my account, this time accompanied by a formal memo line from the trust. The numbers were steady, predictable, transparent. That steadiness brought a kind of peace I had not realized I was missing. A few days later, David came by in the evening. Snow had begun to fall lightly, coating the edges of the parking lot in a thin white layer. He carried no folders this time, no legal envelopes, just a subdued expression and a thermos of hot chocolate he insisted on making himself. We sat at the kitchen table where so much of this had unfolded, and he told me that Victoria had moved back into their house but that the atmosphere remained strained. She says I humiliated her, he admitted. She believes this should have stayed private. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and considered his words carefully. Privacy protects dignity, I said. Secrecy protects advantage. They are not the same. He looked down at the table, absorbing that distinction. Her parents left the lake house yesterday, he added. They did not argue. They seemed embarrassed. I felt no triumph in that. Embarrassment is a heavy teacher. Make sure they are not left without shelter, I said calmly. Correction does not require cruelty. He nodded, perhaps surprised that my concern extended beyond the boundaries of what had happened to me. I have lived long enough to know that justice without restraint can resemble revenge, and I have no interest in that resemblance. The following weekend, I drove to Lake Morrison for the first time. The sky was clear and pale blue, the air crisp at 34 degrees. The house stood exactly as it had in the photographs, wide windows reflecting winter light, the dock stretching quietly into water that looked like polished steel. I stepped onto the porch and paused before unlocking the door. For 2 years, this place had existed as a redirected asset, a symbol of something withheld. Now, it was simply a property with potential. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of pine cleaner. The rooms were spacious, sunlight pooling across hardwood floors. I walked slowly from one window to the next, not claiming the space loudly, just acknowledging it. David followed a few steps behind me, allowing me silence. It is yours, he said softly. I touched the back of a wooden chair near the dining table. It always was, I replied. We spent the afternoon reviewing small repairs that needed attention. A loose railing on the dock. A faucet in the upstairs bathroom that dripped steadily. Minor details, manageable with time and planning. I made notes in my small notebook, the same one I used to track grocery expenses. Ownership does not change the habit of diligence. Before leaving, I stepped outside again and looked across the lake. The surface was calm, the shoreline quiet. I imagined spending a summer morning there with a book, perhaps inviting a few friends for tea on the porch. I also imagined renting it seasonally, creating income that would allow me to update my apartment or donate to the local library that once employed me. Possibility felt expansive, but it did not feel overwhelming. On the drive back to Cedar Grove, David spoke about restructuring some of his company oversight procedures. I realized something, he said. I delegate quickly, sometimes without follow-through. That habit carried into my personal life. I listened, appreciating that his reflection extended beyond the immediate issue. Leadership requires review, I said. In business and at home. Snow began falling again as we entered town, soft and steady. When he dropped me off, he hesitated before turning off the engine. "Mom," he said, "I do not want you to ever feel small again." I placed my hand on his. Feeling small was never the problem, I answered gently. Believing I had to stay that way was. After he left, I entered my apartment and turned on the lamp beside the couch. The space no longer felt confined. It felt chosen. I adjusted the thermostat to 66 degrees and did not calculate the cost. The lake house stood by the water, legally secured, financially structured, no longer an unseen asset but a clear extension of my autonomy. The trust documents rested in my desk drawer. The bank account reflected accuracy. And as winter settled across Ohio, I understood that the true shift had not been the transfer of property. It had been the quiet decision to stand fully inside my own name, without apology, without reduction, and without allowing anyone else to manage my life in the shadows. January arrived with a steadier rhythm than December had offered. The holidays passed quietly. I sent Christmas cards as I always did, handwritten in blue ink, careful loops forming each name. David and Victoria attended a small family dinner at my apartment 2 days after Christmas. The atmosphere was polite, measured, almost formal. Victoria thanked me for the card I had mailed her parents, and I accepted her gratitude with a simple nod. I did not revisit the past in conversation. There was nothing left to argue about. The structure had been corrected. The facts were documented. What remained was behavior moving forward. In early January, I made another trip to Lake Morrison, this time alone. The sky was pale and the air hovered at 31 degrees. Frost traced delicate patterns along the porch railing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, carrying a small overnight bag and a folder containing rental projections I had prepared. I walked through each room again, slower this time, measuring light and space not as something withheld but as something available. I opened the windows briefly to let in crisp winter air and listened to the quiet settle around me. It was not silence in the sense of emptiness. It was silence in the sense of ownership. I spent the afternoon reviewing local rental listings on my laptop, comparing seasonal rates, occupancy trends, and maintenance costs. Numbers do not intimidate me. They simply require patience. By evening, I had outlined a plan to rent the property from May through September, reserving October for personal visits when the leaves turned gold along the shoreline. The projected income would comfortably cover property taxes, utilities, and still allow for savings. I felt a quiet satisfaction in that calculation. Not because of profit, but because of autonomy. The next morning, David called to ask how the house felt without guests. "It feels accurate," I replied. He understood the meaning behind that word. He told me he had begun marital counseling with Victoria. "We need clearer boundaries," he said. About money. About communication. I did not offer advice beyond a simple observation. Boundaries are not walls, I said. They are definitions. Later that week, the accountant finalized a repayment agreement for the funds that had been redirected. Victoria agreed to reimburse the portion used for discretionary expenses over a structured period. The arrangement was professional, documented, free of spectacle. I did not demand urgency. I required accountability. Each month, a portion of the repayment would return to the trust, recorded clearly. Transparency became the rule rather than the exception. In mid-January, I invited 2 close friends to visit the lake house for an afternoon. We brewed tea in the spacious kitchen and sat near the large windows overlooking the water. One of them, a widow like me, traced her fingers along the wooden table and said, "You should host writing retreats here." I smiled at the idea. For years, I had imagined shrinking my world to fit my budget. Now I was expanding it carefully, intentionally. I kept a small notebook beside me and wrote down potential uses: community gatherings, book clubs, seasonal rentals, quiet weekends alone. the property was no longer symbolic. It was practical. Back in Cedar Grove, my apartment no longer felt like a compromise. I replaced the worn bathroom tile in February, something I had postponed for nearly 2 years. I scheduled a comprehensive eye exam without calculating the cost 3 times beforehand. I adjusted the thermostat to 67 degrees on particularly cold evenings and did not feel the need to apologize for warmth. David visited regularly, not out of obligation but out of habit restored. Victoria accompanied him occasionally. Our conversations remained courteous, measured. She did not attempt to justify the past again. Instead, she asked about the rental plan and the trust structure with a tone that suggested she was learning the language of clarity. I did not hold resentment in my voice. I held steadiness. One afternoon, as snow melted slowly along the sidewalks, I stood by the window in my apartment and reflected on how quietly everything had shifted. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no public exposure, no raised voices echoing through hallways. There had been documents reviewed, signatures corrected, funds redirected properly, and a woman who chose not to remain diminished. The lake house stood by Lake Morrison under winter light, legally secure and financially structured. The trust documents rested safely in my desk drawer. The monthly transfers arrived predictably. And within me, something had recalibrated. I no longer equated modest living with invisibility. I no longer assumed that asking questions would burden those I loved. The story had begun with a single Thanksgiving question about a house I had never seen. It had unfolded through paper trails and measured conversations. And now, as January deepened and the air remained crisp across Ohio, I understood that what I had truly reclaimed was not just property or funds. I had reclaimed authorship over my own life, written clearly, documented carefully, and signed only in my own hand. Spring arrived gradually in Cedar Grove, and with it came a clarity that felt earned rather than sudden. By late March, the snow had melted from the sidewalks, and small patches of green began pushing through the cold soil along the edge of the parking lot outside my apartment. The lake house at Lake Morrison had been listed for seasonal rental, exactly as I planned. Within 3 weeks, every summer month from May through September was reserved by families seeking quiet water and long afternoons on the dock. The projected income exceeded my careful estimates, not dramatically, but comfortably. Each confirmed booking appeared in my account with clear documentation, each deposit labeled precisely. I reviewed every agreement personally, reading line by line, asking questions when language felt ambiguous. Ownership had taught me attentiveness in a new way. In early April, David came by with updated financial summaries from the accountant. The repayment schedule Victoria had agreed to was proceeding without delay. A portion of the redirected funds had already been returned to the trust, and the remainder was structured over the coming year. He handed me the report without commentary, and I scanned it quietly. "Everything is transparent now," he said after a moment. I nodded. "Transparency is not loud," I replied. "It is consistent." He sat across from me at the kitchen table, no longer towering in authority but settled in partnership. Our conversations had changed. They were no longer brief holiday exchanges but steady discussions about planning, boundaries, and the kind of structure that protects relationships rather than strains them. Victoria joined us for dinner that evening. She arrived with a homemade pie and a demeanor that carried less defensiveness than before. During the meal, she spoke carefully about the counseling sessions she and David were attending. She did not offer excuses. She spoke about assumptions she had made, about believing efficiency justified control, about confusing management with entitlement. I listened without interruption. Growth does not require applause. It requires consistency. Later that month, I spent my first full weekend alone at the lake house. The air was warmer, reaching 68 degrees by midday. I opened the windows and allowed sunlight to fill every room. I walked along the dock at sunset, the water reflecting soft orange and gold hues. I did not think about what had been taken. I thought about what was available. I brewed tea in the kitchen and sat at the wide dining table, reviewing a new idea that had taken shape in my notebook. Beginning in October, after the rental season ended, would host small weekend retreats for widows in the community. Not formal therapy, just quiet space, shared meals, and time by the water. I contacted the local library director and proposed a partnership for seasonal reading events. The idea was met with enthusiasm. Purpose has a way of expanding once it is no longer constrained by scarcity. When I returned to Cedar Grove, my apartment felt balanced rather than limited. I replaced the aging armchair near the window with a sturdier one, not extravagant but supportive. I scheduled minor dental work I had delayed and paid the bill without anxiety. The thermostat remained at a comfortable 67 degrees most evenings. These were small adjustments, yet they reflected something larger. I was no longer managing around absence. I was managing from stability. In late April, nearly 5 months after that Thanksgiving question, David invited me to dinner at his home. Victoria greeted me at the door with steady eye contact and a simple, "Thank you for coming." The atmosphere felt different from the strained politeness of December. Not perfect, not theatrical, simply grounded. After dinner, David handed me a small folder. Inside was a detailed annual review plan he had implemented for both his business and personal financial oversight. "I realized I need review systems everywhere," he said. I smiled faintly. "Systems protect trust," I replied. As I drove home that evening, passing familiar storefronts and quiet neighborhoods, I reflected on how quietly everything had transformed. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no spectacle of victory. There had been documents corrected, boundaries clarified, and conversations repeated until understanding replaced assumption. The lake house stood by Lake Morrison, rented for the summer and reserved for my own quiet weekends in the fall. The trust held steady. The repayments continued. My name appeared correctly wherever it belonged. And as April deepened into spring, I understood that the true resolution was not about property or money. It was about authorship. For 2 years, decisions had been made in my name without my knowledge. Now every document, every agreement, every plan carried my deliberate consent. The story that began with a single Thanksgiving question had settled into something calmer, something structured, something earned. I no longer reduced myself to accommodate someone else's convenience. I stood fully inside my own life, signed clearly in my own hand, and allowed the future to unfold with clarity instead of assumption.